Hey everyone, welcome back to Creepy Mysteries. First off, a huge thank you to all of you for the amazing support you've shown so far. Your comments and likes mean a lot to me and keep this channel going. If you're new here, I'd love for you to stick around and join our mysterious journey. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. It helps the channel grow and keeps the spooky stories coming. Now let's dive into today's stories. About 2 years ago, my friends and I decided to take a little vacation. It wasn't anything fancy, just a weekend getaway to a quiet beach town on the East Coast. The plan was simple: save some money, relax, and escape the monotony of our daily lives. The trip was my friend Greg's idea. He'd found this cozy little rental on one of those vacation home apps. It was cheap too, because we were going in February, off-season for tourists. When Greg sent us pictures of the house, it looked perfect. A small place with a deck that opened directly onto the dunes and a beach that stretched as far as you could see. It was isolated, surrounded by nothing but sand and seagrass. But that was the point. We wanted to be away from everything. There were 5 of us: me, Greg, my girlfriend Sarah, and our 2 friends Mike and Jessica. We were all in our mid-20s, just looking for an affordable way to kick back for a few days. The drive there took most of the day. As we got closer, the towns became smaller, the streets quieter. By the time we reached the rental, the sun was already setting. The house was just as advertised, a tiny but charming structure perched on a hill overlooking the dunes. The nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away, and the only sounds were the wind and the distant crash of waves. We parked the car, unloaded our bags, and stepped inside. The interior was warm and inviting, with wood-paneled walls and a big couch in the living room. The back of the house had sliding glass doors that opened onto a deck with a breathtaking view of the beach. "This place is sick," Greg said, dropping his bags on the floor. "Yeah, as long as it's not haunted," Sarah joked. Looking back, I wish I'd taken her joke more seriously. That first night, everything seemed normal. We cooked dinner, had a few drinks, and hung out in the living room. At some point, Greg found something wedged between the couch cushions, a small, worn-out notebook. "Looks like someone left their diary," he said, flipping through the pages. The notebook was old, with yellowed pages and a water-damaged cover. Most of the writing was smudged, but what we could make out was unsettling. The first few pages were normal enough, just random notes and doodles. But then halfway through, the tone changed. "Don't stay past sunset." That was the first line that stood out. Beneath it, someone had scribbled, "It's not safe in the dunes after dark." "Creepy," Sarah said, leaning over Greg's shoulder to read. Greg laughed. "Probably just some kid trying to scare people." He flipped through more pages. The handwriting became more frantic, almost illegible in some parts. We made out fragments of sentences. "If you hear footsteps, don't look outside. Stay inside, keep the doors locked." "It comes from the dunes," Jessica shivered. "Okay, this is officially weird. Why would someone leave this here?" "Probably a prank," Mike said. "Someone messing with the renters." We all agreed it was strange, but none of us took it seriously. It was just a notebook after all. We shoved it back between the couch cushions and forgot about it. Later that night, we were sitting in the living room when Sarah froze. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked. We all went quiet. There it was, a faint sound, like shuffling, coming from outside. "Probably the wind," Mike said, but none of us were convinced. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. Greg got up and walked over to the glass doors. "Relax, it's nothing," he said, peering out into the darkness. But even he sounded unsure. The shuffling continued for a few more minutes before stopping abruptly. Greg shrugged it off, but I could tell he was just trying to keep us calm. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt off, too quiet, too still. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, we woke up to an unsettling discovery. There were footprints in the sand around the house. At first, we thought it was one of us, but the footprints were huge, far too big to belong to any of us. They circled the house in a perfect loop, starting and ending at the dunes. Greg frowned. "Okay, that's weird." "Weird. Try terrifying," Jessica said. Who the hell was walking around our house last night? Maybe it's a prank, Mike suggested. Some local kids messing with us. Yeah, but where are their footprints leading to? Sarah asked. That was the strangest part. The sand around the house was untouched except for the loop of footprints. There were no other tracks leading to or from the dunes. It was like whoever, or whatever, made them had just appeared out of nowhere. That evening, things got worse. We were sitting on the deck watching the sunset when Sarah noticed something moving in the dunes. Do you see that? She whispered, pointing toward the beach. We all turned to look. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, in the fading light, I caught a glimpse of something low to the ground, crawling. It moved slowly, almost like it was stalking something. What the hell is that? Jessica whispered. Probably an animal, Greg said, but his voice wavered. We watched it until the sun dipped below the horizon and the dunes disappeared into darkness. Whatever it was, it hadn't moved closer. But that night, the noises came back. It started around midnight. The same shuffling sound, but louder this time. And there was something else. Heavy breathing, like someone was standing just outside the glass doors. Do not open that door, Sarah whispered. We all stayed frozen, listening. The sound circled the house, moving from one side to the other. Greg, being the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door. The second he stepped outside, the noises stopped. The silence was deafening. Greg stood on the porch, shining his flashlight into the dunes. Anything? I asked. No, he said, his voice barely audible. But I swear, I feel like I'm being watched. When he came back inside, he locked the door behind him. We're leaving first thing in the morning, he said. We didn't sleep much that night. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud bang on the glass doors. It sounded like someone had thrown their entire body against the glass. We all jumped up, but when we looked, there was nothing there. Nothing except for those massive footprints in the sand. By sunrise, we were packed and ready to go. None of us spoke much as we loaded the car. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the house. Standing in the dunes, barely visible in the morning light, was a figure, low to the ground, crawling. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched or the eerie warnings in that notebook. Whatever was out there, it wanted us gone, and honestly, I'm just glad we listened. This happened to me last summer when I decided to take a solo hiking trip. I just graduated college and wanted to clear my head before diving into the chaos of real life. I'd always loved hiking and camping, and I figured a weekend alone in the mountains would be the perfect escape. I picked a well-known trail in a national park about 5 hours from where I live. It wasn't overly crowded, but it was popular enough that I figured I wouldn't feel too isolated if something went wrong. I packed my gear, drove up early on a Friday morning, and set out on the trail by noon. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, the scenery was beautiful, and the trail was easy to follow. The main path was well marked with signs and little trail markers every mile or so. But at some point that afternoon, I came across a small wooden sign pointing toward an offshoot trail I hadn't seen on the map. The sign was old and weathered, and the words carved into it were barely legible. From what I could make out, it said something like unmarked trail with an arrow pointing into the trees. I should have just ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me. The main trail was nice, but I'd passed a few hikers earlier, and I was craving a little solitude. So I veered off the main path and started down the unmarked trail. At first, it wasn't much different from the main trail. The path was narrower and a little overgrown, but it was easy enough to follow. It led me through a dense forest with towering pines and sunlight filtering through the branches. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, so quiet that all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional chirp of a bird. After about an hour, though, things started to feel different. The forest became darker, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The trees were thicker here, their branches twisting together overhead like a canopy. The air felt heavier, and the silence became oppressive. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees around me didn't look normal. Their trunks were warped, almost as if they were bending in unnatural ways. Some of them had markings carved into the bark, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, like they'd been there for decades. I started feeling uneasy, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the trail was old, and this part of the forest had been left untouched for years. Still, I decided to turn back, or at least I tried to. When I turned around, I realized the path I'd been following was gone. At first, I thought I'd just gotten turned around. I retraced my steps, or at least what I thought were my steps, but the more I walked, the more lost I became. The trees all looked the same, warped and marked with those strange carvings. Every direction felt identical, and there were no footprints or signs of where I'd come from. That's when the whispers started. At first they were faint, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But as I stood there frozen, they grew louder. It wasn't the wind, it was voices, soft, overlapping whispers coming from all around me. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I was certain of one thing. They were saying my name. I panicked and started running, crashing through the underbrush, not caring which direction I went. I just needed to get away from those voices. The forest seemed endless. No matter how far I ran, the trees didn't thin out, and the path never reappeared. It was like the forest had swallowed me whole. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. That's when I noticed something even stranger. My phone, which I'd been using to track my hike, said I was back at the start of the trail. But that didn't make sense. I was in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees that didn't resemble anything from the start of my hike. I tried using the GPS to find my way back, but the map was glitching out. It showed my location as a tiny dot, spinning in circles, as if it didn't know where I was. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned and caught a glimpse of something darting between the trees. It was quick, too fast to get a good look at, but it wasn't an animal. It was tall, pale, and humanoid, with limbs that moved unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, and now they were accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo through the forest. I started running again, my panic turning into full-blown terror. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into a clearing. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. The clearing was bathed in sunlight, and I could see what looked like a small wooden cabin on the other side. Desperate for help, I sprinted toward the cabin. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin wasn't normal. It was old and crumbling, like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. Carved into the walls were the same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was freezing, and the smell of damp rot filled my nose. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and in the center of the room was a circle of stones with ashes in the middle, like someone had made a fire long ago. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, I heard a sound behind me. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the thing I'd seen in the forest. It was tall, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow like two black voids, and its mouth hung open in an unnatural grin. It didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I don't know how, but my body took over. I ran past it, back into the forest, not looking back. The whispers and footsteps followed me, growing louder and louder until it felt like they were right behind me. Then, just as suddenly as it all began, it stopped. I stumbled out of the forest and onto the main trail, gasping for air. The sun was setting, and the familiar markers of the trail were in front of me. I don't know how I found my way back, but I didn't question it. I ran all the way to my car, threw my gear inside, and sped out of there without looking back. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that forest, but I've never gone hiking alone again. And that wraps up today's story. I really hope it resonated with you or gave you something to think about. Stories like these are what keep me passionate about creating, and your support makes it all worthwhile. If you've got any thoughts, opinions, or even your own experiences to share, don't hold back. Drop them in the comments. I'd love to start a conversation and hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, make sure you stick around. I've got plenty more coming that I think you'll love. Thanks so much for watching, for being here, and for supporting this journey. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.